Thank you, Dr. Inda, for that very generous introduction. And thank you all for taking a Wednesday afternoon to come spend some time with me, and hopefully I'll make it worth your while. At the very least, I promise to be a little entertaining. But as is the case for some of you that have been to some of my presentations in the past, I always start out, given the nature of my research dealing with social harm and violence, I always like to open it up first with a moment of silence to sort of recognize, all the lives that I was able to talk with in the process of doing the project, and all the lives that I was unable to talk to. I also invite you to think of individuals, communities, people who have experienced and encountered various forms of harm that go most often unanswered for. And so if we could just have a few moments of silence, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So my presentation today represents a tiny slice of my much larger project that is designed to document and understand the experiences of transgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer Latinos and their experiences with social harm, the meaning they assign to such encounters, and what these meanings ultimately tell us about emotions, identity, and social harm in the United States. This larger study in my talk today is based upon the life story narratives of 26 TLGBTQ identified Latinos who lived at the time of the interview or for a major period of their life in Texas. Life stories have a long history in sociology, but they are also incredibly helpful in relation to this project, given the Latin American and Latino tradition of testimonio, a form of life story meant to provide a witness account of personal experiences, often about trauma, with the express purpose of connecting these events to larger socio-political practices. The length of the life story interviews ranged from just over an hour to more than 4 hours in duration, with younger participants tending to have the shorter life stories. Each interview was conducted in person or via Skype, with recruitment facilitated through personal, organizational, and social media networks that then incorporated a snowball method. And each participant received a $25 Visa gift card as a small, albeit a small form of compensation. And so I just wanted to provide just these very general brief notes about the overall method used for the data collection and the project. This is all I'm going to present on method for today's talk, but if you do have questions about, more questions about method, I really encourage you to ask those questions during the Q&A. My talk today builds upon my idea of racial utterance, a concept I developed in my dissertation to theorize and explain the narrative practice many of the queer Latino participants utilize to represent their experiences of racial social harm. Where my effort in the dissertation was to document and explain the phenomenon of racial utterance, in today's talk I return to my data and the concept of racial utterance to extrapolate the lessons it holds for complicating and deepening our knowledge as it relates to what scholars have termed microaggressions. Before I delve into the existing literature, I would like to first turn to some observations provided by one of my research informants, Isidro Zapata, regarding his experience with racial social harm. Isidro's comments beautifully crystallize the issues and questions animating my presentation this afternoon. Isidro Zapata is 53 years old, and when I sit across from him on his couch in his living room, Isidro's life began in the relatively rural part of Texas, the Panhandle, where his family owned a general store that catered primarily to the region's Mexican-American and migrant farm worker populations. He remained in his hometown for the first half of his life, whereupon he decided to relocate to Central Texas. where he decided to relocate to Central Texas as a strategy to get away from an abusive white boyfriend. He managed this by transferring between offices of his telecommunications employer. Once he relocated, Isidro was not only able to extricate himself from a physically and emotionally harmful relationship, but he decided to re-enroll in college and complete his bachelor's degree. It was during this transition period between the completion of his college education and the downsizing of his employer that precipitated what would ultimately be a fortuitous experience for Isidro and the meaning he would come to assign to his past and future encounters with racial social harm. He accepted a 6-month buyout package from his company that allowed him to volunteer with the Queer Latino activist organization, whose primary focus at the time was HIV prevention and case management services. This volunteer work ultimately resulted in a full-time job for Isidro at the organization. During our conversation, I asked him, okay, what was working there, a Queer Latino organization, like? He responded, that was when I really sort of had my education, my awakening in terms of how me being Latino has affected me, not only in the gay world, but in the world as the outside. It really opened up my eyes with a lot. What opened it up like that? How did that happen? Just becoming more aware of what was going on. I mean, I'm sure I had experienced discrimination. I'm sure I've experienced these types of feedback in the white world, and I either blew them off or didn't want to acknowledge it or set it aside. But now I'm talking with different people on what they had dealt with, what they were going through, and me certainly saying, oh yeah, that's right, I have been through the same thing. It kind of led to that awakening, and so I became much more aware and sensitive about how me being, affected the group around me. Now, Isidro describes a shift and a transformation in his awareness and sensitivity to the amount and depth of racial social harm populating his life experience. He makes reference to being certain he had experienced racial discrimination and negative feedback in the white world, but at the time of these incidents, he ignored, minimized, or only subconsciously cataloged such traumas. In the entirety of Isidro's 3-hour life story testimonio, it is apparent the majority of discrimination and feedback he speaks of are what scholars of racial microaggression classically refer to as micro-invalidations and micro-insults. Despite this awakening occurring during his mid-20s, Isidro provides a litany of examples of racial social harm weaving pain in and out of earlier periods in his life. On a side note, it is telling that Isidro never identifies a similar shift in awareness or sensitivity to sexuality-related microaggressions. Indeed, from his testimonio, it would seem he never needed such a transformation. Now, his ability to recall racially traumatic events with some measure of detail from before this change in sensitivity suggests that Isidro did experience racial microaggressions and, more importantly, felt pain related to these incidents, even if it did not populate the fullness of his consciousness in the way pain is often assumed to operate. This is a critical observation because within microaggression scholarship, targets and recipients of this form of social harm are constructed and portrayed as almost always being conscious and well aware of the microaggression harm shaping their life. But what if a person is only partially conscious or not conscious at all of the microaggressions directed at them? Does this mean the microaggression did not occur? Does this mean no harm has transpired? The practice I term racial utterance, which I observed as part of my larger study, provides both empirical evidence and a theoretical explanation to answer these and other related questions. Current microaggression scholarship emphasizes the relative unconsciousness of perpetrators and when they regarding their microaggressions and the harm they are committing. This overemphasis in the literature, I believe, is a reflection of both methodological constraints and conceptual limitations that has elided important dimensions of the scholarly, intellectual, political, and ethical discussions around microaggressions. To be clear, current microaggression scholarship has contributed a tremendous amount to our understanding of contemporary manifestations of racism, sexism, transphobia, and homophobia. The constraints and limitations I'm articulating today is an attempt to stake out the next steps for what I believe to be a fruitful next generation of microaggression research.